to great entrepreneurs who have been there, done that. So for the first speaker who's going to share his incredible story, we have Dheeraj Pandey, who is the former founder and former CEO of Nutanix. And Dheeraj founded Nutanix in 2009 and helped it grow from $0 to a $1.8 billion in revenue by 2020. When he stepped down to found his latest venture, DevRev. Nutanix was one of the largest tech IPOs when it had gone public. When it debuted on Wall Street in 2016, he has been recognized with several prestigious industry awards, including Dell Founders 50 and E&Y Entrepreneur of the Year, Silicon Valley. He holds a degree in computer science from IIT Kanpur, and in addition, and an MS in computer science from the University of Texas at Austin. In addition, he was a graduate fellow of computer science at the University of Texas at Austin PhD program. So can we please have a round of applause for Dheeraj? The next speaker we have is Rajal Gerig, who I have had the privilege of working with, is the founder and managing partner of Leo Capital India. He's passionate about company building and takes an active role in working with Leo's portfolio companies. Earlier, Rajul has been a serial entrepreneur and founded large, successful companies like Pine Labs, GlobalLogic, and Sunstone. Yes, all of this in one lifetime. Prior to founding Leo, Rajul was a prominent angel investor and was an early investor in companies such as Meesho, 1MG, and other companies as well. So another round of applause for Rajul, please.
And I think it's always challenging to be the panel after lunch. Dheeraj, I could see you eating the malpuas, and I was wondering, you just come from the US, like, is this the right thing to do? I feel for you.
It's been 4 or 5 days, and you get ruggedized by the 4th day,
But so good they were.
Yeah, they were very good.
That's the thing. But pleasure to have all of you here on our joint behalves of Leo Capital and DevRev. It's kind of a unique event. I haven't been to such things before, so I think great to have. I got the opportunity to talk to some of you, so fantastic, and hopefully we'll have an interesting chat in the next hour or so. Dheeraj, I think Shikha, obviously gave like a summary of our experiences, but obviously the story is much more topsy-turvy. And events take place as they take place, as in business building. I think what would be useful maybe for the audience is maybe a little bit sort of story aspect of the intro, like how you went about it a little bit, and also just relevance in today's market a little bit, right? I mean, also just forward-looking that because everybody I met here was kind of an entrepreneur. How many, raise your hands if you're an entrepreneur here building a startup? There you are. So I think we have like a pretty entrepreneurial room here. So I think what will be useful to hear to people is relevance to them and sort of, especially in the current market environment and, because there's constant talk of a downturn and all that. So maybe that'll be a good start and, we can dive down a little bit more into
Thank you. And thank you, Rajul. I mean, I'm sure the questions will go back to you as well as a fellow entrepreneur. I mean, you've done some things that were equally tenacious and, came out to become pervasive in the Indian market and beyond, especially GlobalLogic that went global. And at the onset, I just want to thank everybody for being here because, time is the most precious thing that we can all invest, and the fact that you folks are investing your time today means a lot. Our team here at DevRev is here to learn. We have folks coming not just from Bangalore and Chennai, but also from all around the world. We have folks coming from Minneapolis and Dallas and obviously the Bay Area. So it means a lot for all of you to be here. And DevRev is young. It's like basically we've been writing code for the last 14 months, but at the same time, I think this is the time to get a lot of deep feedback. And I think in many ways, even the best of products will go through their first couple of years, I remember when we saw a phone without a keyboard, it was awkward. Like, how can it have not have a keyboard? And people used to like their Blackberries because there were tactile keyboards in there, and there was no copy and paste in the first version of iOS. So not everybody will like DevRev, but there are people who are in this bell curve as innovators and early adopters, and we're here to really look for those people who want to really improve the product and fight for copy and paste, and also be very comfortable not ever having a keyboard that's tactile, because it takes time to really get used to that kind of a experience. But going back like 12 years now, 13 years, 2009, when we started Nutanix, I mean, the idea was to just chase your gut,
And 2009, for those of you, because there's a lot of young people here, 2009 was kind of a crisis time. I mean, we're just coming off the Great Recession in 2008, and every crisis is different. But I mean, it was very much a crisis at that time.
Absolutely, and in fact, in a way, it was the polar opposite of today's crisis, because back then there was all sorts of quantitative easing and giving out another $1 trillion here, another $1 trillion there, because we had created a mess with the global financial crisis. The housing bubble had burst, and I think it was quite dire, and the markets were still early. I mean, I think it took 9 months for Wall Street to recover, and probably 18 to 24 months for Main Street to recover in terms of buying again and taking risks with respect to new technologies. But it's also the best time. I was saying this to Siddharth yesterday, in one of the questions that he asked was, so what's it about these crisis moments that the best companies come out of? And what I was telling him, which he really liked, was the pent-up demand is there. So people have hunkered down to the point where they're not buying anything at all for 18, 24 months, because that's how long Main Street takes to recover. But once they open up their purse strings, because now they're willing to go spend some, they are willing to tinker, and they get more optimistic about new tech and willing to take more risks. So I think that happened with us as well. It took us 2 years to build something. We were pretty awkward in the first, I would say, 6 months. The product had a lot of rough edges, and that's basically true for any new infant. It's most babies are ugly when they're born, and it actually takes time for things to actually improve. And the good thing is, unlike Nutanix this time at DevRev, we are using our own product. And very few companies get this sort of
eat your own dog food
kind
of thing.
And in a way where every developer is using it 24/7. The daily active use per user is probably 8 to 10 hours. So we're really trying to make that as smooth as possible for even the beta customers. But yeah, I think back in the day, the idea was to quit our jobs and follow a gut. And the gut was still very nebulous. I don't think we had an idea of what we wanted to do. But there was this impatience, the same impatience that drove so many of you to really quit your jobs and do something extraordinary. Was something that took a couple of years.
Just double clicking on that, let's say first year or two, right? I mean, how did you zero in on the idea of Nutanix and what you guys were doing? And at what point would you say you felt that we have some sort of product market fit, and hey, there's something real here, that we should build on? Like, was there like a moment in time?
By the way, while I'm speaking, you should also think about the answer for Pine Labs and as to what happened there as well. But yeah, I think there was a passion for distributed systems. We had been doing some data management stuff before that. Distributed systems was always a part of it, whether it was going to my first startup back during the dot-com bust, which was 8 years before that. There was another bust.
Yep.
Many of you were not born during that bust. But we've seen a couple of busts, and this is the third bust that we're going through right now. And, there's some element of anti-fragility about this. Like, look, it's going to come and go. You just have to have the staying power. But a lot of the experience before that, for 10 years, as I was working, and a couple of my co-founders, all of us had gone through this. There was a common thread in distributed systems and building products and commodity hardware and clustered systems and so on. So that was the passion. But then the thing was, what's the killer app for this data management platform? and the public clouds were, consumer clouds were building with commodity hardware and no proprietary hardware. And it had been proven by now that Yahoo basically became irrelevant because they were using proprietary hardware. Lots of Oracle, lots of Sun, lots of NetApp, and so on and so forth, as opposed to Google that was basically building itself for the mom and pop advertiser. And they were building it for millions of advertisers. And then eventually they hollowed Yahoo bottom up, from the grassroots to the point where the top 500 advertisers of the world said, look, if these people can use Google platform, so can we. So I think there was a trend in the consumer cloud towards commodity, and we wanted to bring that commodity notion to the enterprise. And initially, I think most people were skeptics. They're like, why? I mean, I have my storage box and my compute server and my networking systems, and we were trying to come and converge them, saying, look, in the public cloud, you don't have these silos, and people just buy a lot of uniform hardware, and they repurpose them as servers and as storage boxes. And yeah, they do have some configs, but it's not like they have proprietary stuff coming that can only be used for one and one purpose only. So I think there was a lot of pushback from the large enterprise early on, because that's where you have the most sort of real silos that have emerged. And but then we started with the mid-market. I think they started to get this thing that virtualization is young, and we have to really make virtualization commodity, and it can happen with commodity hardware first. Product market fit was really not a destination as much as a journey, which is some of the things we're also trying to do at DevRev, is trying to figure out how do you really, we can't figure out what is PMF. Is like, well, even 5 years later, you're still trying to figure out PMF with the large enterprise, with a new use case, a new workload. So PMF never stops, especially if you keep going after new use cases. There will be a product market fit issue to go deal with. But our first use case, I think, even at DevRev, we're learning this, that there are basically 3 pillars to PMF. There is one around velocity, which means that you have true empathy for the initial user who is willing to invest time, even if not money upfront. They're willing to invest time with you, that they want to see like rapid back and forth going back. So velocity is very important. And the second one is really around convergence, the fact that you're negotiating with the market. They're obviously the late majority is looking for everything and then some, while these early adopters, you have to negotiate with them about how less is more, because you don't want your initial users to basically saying, look, I'm sitting here, I want everything, and then things on top, versus the people who are saying, look, I really feel there's something here, there's 10x, there's a lot of rough edges, so let's go focus on that. So convergence is really important, where you deal with folks, you negotiate with the early users on less is more. And the third is really the little things, delight. The fact that there's lots of things that you could actually be fixing as part of your experience that really helps. Not having all the features, because that is already a big handicap that you're bringing to the product. But if you really took care of the little things, the Japanese call it kodawari, I think the initial user appreciates that as well. So I think a combination of velocity, convergence, and delight can actually even be codified in software. So we're trying to do some of those things in software so that people know that they're high velocity, they're dealing with fewer things, and their own internal parts are converging, because you end up building too many things that are not really converged. And finally, delight. But you tell me about Pine Labs. How was that experience like? And it was also a time of recession, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, I'll just talk about that in a minute. But I just want to. I think one of the audience members I was talking to, I think Samir, I don't know if he's here, but just before this session we were talking, he said about DevRev platform that, I love the details. So I think you want to talk to him. I said, you should talk to the DevRev team. I'm sure they will love you. But he was like, this is fantastic. I said, what did you like? He said, it's the details. It's like the little things, they seem to work, like this connecting, this code to revenue. He explained the same thing, and I said, okay, good that he explained. At the 5,000 feet level, it's hard to understand, but when you double click on it, then you obviously get to know.
And by the way, that is the path of PMF, because these people are self-selected early adopters. They know that it has quirks, but they're willing to champion. and many of these folks actually want to convert from being users to being evangelizers, and that is a very elusive journey of PMF in many ways. But
yeah, no, I think
Pine Labs
Pine Labs. I think so. Pine Labs, I guess many of you know because it's so omnipresent in India at this point of time. We go to a restaurant and my kids always point, "Oh, our dad made this. Our dad made this." Like quite, I'm proud but embarrassed also, all the time. So
why embarrassed, by the way?
it's kind of in a restaurant, like I mean the waiter doesn't care, who made it. He wants to get paid and gets tipped properly. No, I mean just mostly proud. So Pine Labs actually, I started right out of college in '98 when I graduated, and it was just very serendipitous kind of journey. Somebody wanted to get some software done. Before I knew it, I started writing payment software. Then there was a choice to kind of go outside to study more or build a startup. I built a startup. It eventually turned into Pine Labs. So it was kind of a meandering journey. It was not as, let's say, well thought of. Like I didn't have any experience in payments or things like that. It was kind of one thing led to another kind of thing, But I think the lesson from Pine Labs, and it was started in '98, and then 2001 happened, and again, big crisis. We almost died pretty much. The company pivoted a couple of times before it became Pine Labs. But I think the big lesson that I sort of learned from Pine Labs, and it's a business model lesson, that at least in India, for the first, it's a startup which bootstrapped for a long time, and it finally kind of exploded. Let's say the hockey stick growth came 13, 14 years later after starting, in 2013, 14 or 12, 13, somewhere about that time.
Was it mobile that actually
No, it wasn't. So for the first 12, 13 years, we were a provider to the banks. So our customer was HDFC Bank, and ICICI Bank, and no disrespect, but it was just really hard to work with them. I hope, I don't want my bank account to shut down tomorrow, but I think, but they were just really hard to work with. And I think my lesson again in India was that and I worry when I see a lot, I'm just damaged when I see a lot of new banks today as VCs, as a VC, that, what will happen to these guys, because these banks are like devil incarnate themselves, I mean, like they will squeeze out every penny from you, over a period of time. And the contracts are not as enforceable in India as they're in the US. People are not used to writing, large checks. Like somebody must be writing like, $5 million check to Nutanix today, let's say, as a customer. No bank in India is writing 5 crore check, 10 crore check, to anyone unless it's TCS or something like that, right, which is like very visible. So I think, so for the first 12, 13 years, we were behind the banks. And we had a good product. Everybody was using it. The choice was to either just stay that or to go directly to merchants. So somewhere in 12, 13, this pivot happened, where we went directly to merchants. And it was a scary thing because banks suddenly became our competitors, right? So banks are saying that, hey, you were like my partner until yesterday. Now you're competing with me. So we made a terminal which would basically route the transaction most efficiently. So if HDFC charges you least, it'll charge you to send it to HDFC. If ICICI charges you least, it'll send you to ICICI. So merchants loved it, right? But banks hated us. So, we got a few lawsuits, we got all kinds of things. But literally once we saw through that, the company just took off, and then we had the power because we were working with the merchants. So then we launched, more and more products over time. We launched rewards, loyalty.
I'm smiling as you're saying this because there were 3 hidden things that came out of this. One, and this is very common to what happened in Nutanix as well. So one is the near-death experiences. So I'm going to talk about mine and you should talk about yours. The second one is as partners become competitors. And the last one is, whether you want a consolidated, unfragmented market, or do you really want a fragmented market where you have mitigated risk because now the decision-making is happening faster, there's smaller customers, and I think all 3 of these are probably quite instructive for the audience too. So I'll start with just normalizing failure and death and near death and everything else, and you should do the same. Because I feel like in an entrepreneurship journey, people have to say, look, if it happened to them and yet they survived, it could happen to me too, So at Nutanix, we assume that, VMware should work underneath us. There was a substrate on top of which we're building this new app that was going to replace all the hardware that NetApp and EMC and all these storage companies had actually built. And it was pure software running on top of VMware. And the damn thing just didn't work for like a year after we thought we had GA'd it or something, So there's a lot of rigor and, just being tenacious and working it through. And, the early engineers were the folks that we could really be grateful to, and, how they were just willing to plow through some of this uncertainty. Because, at the end of the day, the thing that differentiates at least companies that survive and eventually thrive versus the ones that probably had equally good idea is being tenacious. So say more about the near-death experience that you folks went through as well,
So, I mean, we've had so many that, I think we'll need more time. But I think I will just start by saying that I think we should just all be grateful in general, that we're sort of getting to work on startups, there's hopefully funding around, we can sort of build these businesses, get an opportunity to do like a wonderful act of creation, right? Which I don't think was possible, at least in India, when I graduated, 98, when you graduated on that time, right? This was not common. Like we would typically either go to the US or, we would sort of go for further studies and things like that. Mm-hmm. So I think but multiple, because I've seen through 2001, we were in Pine Labs, and we see through 2008, which was a GlobalLogic story. We've seen through, so Ukraine, what we're seeing today, actually affected GlobalLogic directly back in 12, 13. So there was rumors of that happening. We were getting sold at that time. And GlobalLogic is even today, or until last year, was the biggest company in Ukraine, biggest tech company in Ukraine, by the way. 3,000, 4,000 engineers,
You're right. I totally forgot that you guys had a big Ukraine presence.
We had a huge Ukraine presence, and I'm not involved with the company anymore, so I don't know what is happening with the current scenario. But I think shit just happens. I think the macro stuff, something happens, and you can't plan for it. There's nothing you can do about it. But what you can do, and I was talking to one of our entrepreneurs yesterday, is to keep your chin up. I think you've lost the moment you think you're lost. Because I see it in our portfolio, we have like 35 companies, and, so there's all kinds, right? So there's kind of, once you think that, ab kya hoga, right? How will I who will fund me? This, that kind of thing. And, you get into that loop. It's already begins to look bad for you. So I think I think the key thing is to keep your chin up, keep bring back the focus on business building. Like many times, like in Bangalore, when I ask entrepreneurs, how's your business going? The answer I get is, yeah, we just raised $6 million. Like, isn't that right? That's very common. Half the time, like with this gluttony of funding, people are just not interested in talking about products or revenues. And I'm sorry to say that, many VCs are not interested either. They're like, okay, who funded you last, right? That kind of thing, has taken dominance. So I think I come from the old school, which is keep your head down, keep doing business building, and, value will get created.
Talk about customers.
Yeah, talk about customers and talk about products and talk about the value that you're adding, and, good things will happen.
Yeah, the second one, which is again the one of the hidden messages, is around how partners become competitors. It happened to us. Manoj joined us in 2013. And he had the first oh shit moment when we had come up with a new hardware partner from Taiwan, directly from Taiwan. It's like, oh, if Amazon can buy from Taiwan, why, or Google can buy from Taiwan, why can't we buy from Taiwan? And it wasn't to be. I think it was an utter failure. We had a $25 million quarter goal for that quarter or something, and we just had to stop ship. And this was a company that was, by this time, already $100 million revenue business, and we had to stop everything and say, look, we've got to figure this out. To 2014, by which time VMware had started to really say, look, we want to expand, because they had really commoditized the compute virtualization space, and now they were trying to get into data management and storage. And all of a sudden, they saw all this talent leaking to us, and pretty much a lot of the best salespeople were actually coming and joining us. And it was quite one of those moments where we felt cornered, similar to probably what happened to you with the banks, or what Apple went through with Maps against Google, because they didn't have Maps, and Google was really asking for a lion's share of the pie when it came to location services, so they had to go build their Maps. So Manoj and the team actually went and built a compute virtualization story around us. But I think the key for us, I think and including for what I had to go through the next 6-7 years of that dichotomy, was being schizophrenic about VMware and about us, because we could do all of it, but then we had to be so respectful of the customer. So it's not an either or nor, like, well, because we have this thing that could completely displace VMware, we didn't want to go and apply a tax on the customer, So this paradox that you have to maintain, there's a left brain that wants to go a certain way and the right brain that wants to really listen to the end user and the customer was probably very important. I don't know if you folks had similar dichotomy as well.
No, totally. I think, and even now when we look at entrepreneurs, I mean, if you find this combination of what you're calling left brain, right brain, you can call it IQ, EQ, you can call it sort of empathy and intelligence, right? I mean, whichever way you phrase it. But I think this combination is rare. I think I know several of our entrepreneurs who are really intelligent, but I mean, I think they can do better on empathy. They can, be more empathetic with their customers, with their teams, and I know they will be infinitely better off. So I think it's really it's a rare combination. Sometimes it's not there in one person, but it's there in the team. I think we were lucky, honestly. I think we were lucky to be able to build a good team. And that's the other thing I think we should talk about a little bit, as a detour. But we're lucky to be able to build a good team. And I hope that in our team, there's a person I met today, Swati. I don't know if she's here. There she is. So, I mean, she's, she worked for GlobalLogic last year. So she was just telling me, and I've left for 10 years. The company got sold 9 years, right? So she said that, it was great culture. I enjoyed working. And she was telling me some of the things, very friendly policies. And I remember setting those up, back in the day, like in 2009, 2010. So I said, I'm just so happy to hear that some of that culture is continuing because, it's changed hands a couple of times and the company's gone really big. So I think we're just coming back to your point. I think this left brain, right brain combination is, I think, really a force multiplier if you can have it in your leadership team, and it's not so common, from what I see.
And the imagery that I kind of remind myself of in this entrepreneurial journey is that, when you're a small company, you're still walking a tightrope. When you're a mid-sized company, the rope just went a little higher. And when you're a large company, the rope just went really, really high. But you're still walking a tightrope, and if you try to lean in too much towards one side, you'll fall, So keep that imagery in mind about the paradox. Like you'll always have to deal with opposites, always. And one day you'll be paranoid, the other day you'll be optimistic. One day you'll think about short term, the other day you'll think about long term. One day you'll think about, letting chaos reign because everybody wants to do everything. And then the other day you'll wake up and say, I need to reign in chaos. And this time the reign is without the G. But I think it's really important to bring that level of schizophrenia to your entrepreneurial journey as well.
Yeah. There's two things, just taking a detour. I do want to talk about team building a little bit, but I also want to talk about fundraising just for a second, because I know it's so much on entrepreneurs' mind. So like, again, how many of you are trying to raise funds in the next 6 months? Show of hands. I mean, I'm surprised that it's fewer hands. I would expect it almost 100%.
He has a money bag right behind his chair. So.
I wish. but yeah, so I mean, also maybe we can just contrast a little bit the Bay Area and India, though I guess it's become more and more similar over years. But I mean, how is your experience in fundraising, especially the first time on? I'm assuming this time it would have been much different. And how should an entrepreneur look at fundraising? And again, when I started actually Pine Labs, there was no funds around. So we didn't raise for a long time because there was just no availability. But later on, from 2010s and all that, it became more and more prominent. So I raised in my second and third venture, and now we invest. So, but I think I would love to just your perspective on fundraising in general and your experiences doing with that, and how should people think about it today? Let's say. Yeah.
There's a really good concept that I got introduced to like 3, 4, 5 years ago. I didn't realize I was using that to a large extent in my life. It's called the bird in hand principle. Basically entrepreneurs do with what they have, who they know, and what they've done in the past in some sense. So I think my journey in 2009 was who I knew, and this is the person that I'd rubbed my shoulders with at Oracle for 4 years in 2003 and 7, Bipul Sinha, who is CEO at Rubrik, and used to be at a small fund, like $100 million fund in 2009. They invested probably $2 million over a year and a half. And
they did well for themselves, I'm sure.
And we returned $225 million to them, in like a matter of 7-8 years. But he was also hungry because it was his sort of first VC gig as he had come out of Oracle. And we were also right there, and I think we didn't have to go and really knock a lot of doors. So there was a little bit of, I would say, luck as well. You can call it serendipity.
Timing, being in the right place, whatever.
Yeah, and both sides wanted a win in many ways. There was a win-win situation for him. This was his second investment, and then people had come to hear that these 3 guys had left Astra Data to start this thing, and so Lightspeed started to knock at our doors and like, oh, we don't need any money right now. We still have a deck of slides, which is when Lightspeed went and said, okay, let's go hire Bipul, and then we'll figure out what to do about Nutanix. So he ended up being hired at Lightspeed, and then Lightspeed did the first $10 million check. But then I think what was different in 2009 was that it was still a buyer's market. Buyers being VCs, in some sense, and 10 years later, I could say the whole thing had turned upside down. And in many ways, right now, we have a good balance. There's a ton of money, but at least there's also this sort of realism about we're not going to throw money at everything, yeah, I think the first 10 million, we gave up 50% of the company or something, but it was probably what the 2010 timeline really had in store. I would say that if I were to do it again, which is what we're doing right now, you stretch the dollar. I mean, we came to India a lot later, 2013, when we could have done much sooner, and put your own money, which is what we've done at DevRev. Manoj and I and many friends of DevRev, including employees, have put in a ton of money, and we've raised 70 million without even valuing the company right now. But again, money doesn't guarantee success, so we are pretty grounded about that. It's a necessary condition, but not a sufficient condition for success. And we feel like we have bought some staying power, but that doesn't mean that we'll actually be successful. So it's going to come down to a lot of developers here who will help us through the journey to really figure that out. I think what also helped us over time was, this is the third, fourth round of funding, was, a better design helped, because people were starting to talk about 2 things about the company. One is they're very simple to use, and the customers love them. So all the VCs, they were trying to do interviews with customers. They're like, slam dunk. Customer support is the best in the world, and they are like 10x easier to use, So we didn't, because initially we had to discount our way into success. I mean, our gross margins went from very poor, like 20% in 2011, 2012 to 82% in 2020, So the way we built the trust was not trying to be extremely arrogant about margins upfront, We said, no, we got to really, because once you get in there, you start to realize that you're a sticky product and they love your customer support. So you can start to charge more, not because you're price gouging, but because over time they want to pay you more for those things as well, And that happened, I think US Federal was one of our largest sectors. I think by the time I left, we had done almost $1 billion with US Federal, And came to realize that there was a ton of pain points that you would have to really go solve for them. But we had a low margin business early with the US Federal, but over time it became one of the highest margins. US Federal in Japan were the highest margin businesses for us, And that's an important thing for entrepreneurs as well, is like, unless you're really doing PLG, which we'll talk more about in the coming minutes, when it's sales-led, you probably have a way to win the trust of your end user one deal at a time.
Yeah, no, just taking I want to just comment a little bit on the fundraising market, what we're seeing in India right now, but then come back to PLG, and actually there are many SaaS companies which are trying to build from here. So I'm sure they would love to hear from you what they can do for more success, which probably also leads into PLG and all that. But just back to fundraising, look, India market, as you all know, has evolved a great deal. I mean, we've seen momentum build up right through, I think, early 2000s to, where we are today. Last year was obviously the balance shifted, like you were talking about, in the favor of the sellers, the entrepreneurs. I mean, literally, I can tell you, we would get a company on a Monday, and they would be like just say bhede ki tarah toot padta hai. Like multiple VCs would try to engage with the company.
He's calling himself a bhediya right now.
Not us, we are the sheep. The big ones. And it would be done by Thursday. So we have to really move our butt, if we wanted to get something done. But, it wasn't always like that. People forget, 2019, 2020 was, early 2020 was very different. And, this year is different again, right? So, I mean, markets have moderated. There's more time, there's more business building talk, there's more, so I would say it's more balanced today. I wouldn't say, because that's a word that you use for Bay Area, I would say that's how I would describe India. I think there is a lot of money around, VCs are sitting on dry powder, we are open for business, most of the funds, the bunch of funds here, plenty of funds open for business and looking for opportunities, but there is more balance, both in terms of pricing, and in terms of just the diligence and where people want to invest and things like that. But there is plenty of money around and companies are getting funded, all the time. But coming back to SaaS specifically, because we have a bunch of SaaS entrepreneurs, and this is a theme which is built up in India, over the last 20 years, because, global services economy, we've been selling to the West for 40 years, like TCS, Infosys and all that, but doing services. And now, over the last 10, 15 years, we've seen some successes, Freshworks, and now so many others. What can companies sitting in India, so think of an entrepreneur in Bangalore or in Gurgaon, right, who are completely here, and many of them have never really been to the US as well. Mm-hmm. They can go, right, but they've never been, but they want to tap into global markets. What's the way to think about it? How do you get some early success, $500,000 ARR, how do you sort of just take it off, when you start?
By the way, we're also learning. So it's good to be in the student's chair one more time, because I think PLG as a term is still early. It's like the way internet was in 95. I think PLG is like that. The good thing is that there is a model to copy, which is B2C, and if B2B starts to look more and more like B2C, then I think we have learned enough, because many of the things that are going on in the SaaS world are, very similar now. It's like, hey, freemium, no questions asked, come in and do a sign up. What we have to be careful about is, be careful what you ask for. Like Dropbox eventually said, look, we don't want the Brazilian and the Indian free user, because
they'll never convert.
They'll never convert, right? They never converted. And to the point where they started to bemoan what it really meant to have millions of free users that you can't convert. I think, there's a balance. It's again a paradox of how do you really figure out the funnel and what makes it the top of the funnel somewhat thankful, like how do you stay thankful to the top of the funnel? If you didn't do your engineering right, and if each tenant was expensive, which is the customer acquisition cost, you guys talk about CAC all the time. If each tenant was very expensive, you will never like the PLG model. And it's fine. This is not to say that you can't build a mid-market and an enterprise business sitting out of India. It's just that eventually you need to go and hire a ton of salespeople in the US first, and then in Western Europe, and then the rest of the world. And probably the engineering challenges are different. If anything, one of the biggest challenges of business software in the mid-market and the large enterprise is customization. Can you customize it for every individual business's needs and requirements? Which, by the way, is a really hard platform problem. ServiceNow did a really good job of it. SAP did a really good job of it, and that's why they focused really, on the high end of the market. But I feel like this is the time when you can actually have your cake and eat it too. You can build a piece of software, the platform that's highly customizable for the high end of the market, but it's also extremely simple to use. I think that's the challenge that we are really trying to solve at DevRev. But I think it's an opportunity for every entrepreneur out here is to say, look, we were talking to somebody yesterday before, and they're like, we loved the intercom experience, but it was too expensive for us. And then they named another company and said, crappy experience, but it's cheap. I'm like, why can't it be inexpensive and have a really good experience, So I think that's the gauntlet has been thrown to entrepreneurs. There's a ton of design talent in India now. They should think hard about design upfront. VCs appreciate good design. They're like, look, if they figure out what this means, they'll figure out everything else as well, it is one of the, it's a hidden gem is for any company is a ton of designers. We have like 12 designers, and now we have 12 PMs who are also quasi-designers in our company as well. So it feels like that's going to be a big part of this India-based story.
So don't underinvest in design, don't underinvest in product management.
Yeah, and by the way, design also includes the backend of customizable backend. It's like if you don't have customizable backend, you'll never be able to go to the mid-market or in the high end of the enterprise at all, because they all have needs that are not the same as what you conceived when you were sitting in your little room with only your own employees and designers and so on. I think obviously there's a lot to learn from Freshworks and some of these companies out here, which is really the grassroots story about search engine optimization. How do you really get awesome at SEO? I think we are also learning. There is Uncle Google to go and sort of mess around with. The other day we were sitting with this savant of a developer who was like, oh yeah, you can do programmatic SEO. I'm like, what does that mean? So he explained that concept about programmatic SEO. But there's a lot of engineering in SEO that I think this room can figure itself out. Chennai has become big in SEO work because of Freshworks and everything. But that'll help you with the grassroots. Eventually you need a combination of that with either inside sales or some such thing for the mid-market and higher enterprise as well.
Yeah. The good thing is that companies have done it here, like Freshworks and now a bunch of others. B, I think the talent is more available. You can find people who have done some of this before. So I think the key is mid-market in early years, because you can't realistically get to enterprises, sitting from here as a startup company. That's just too hard, I think.
Yeah, and the question is, do you postpone it too long? Like now, the sales and marketing costs of Freshworks is baked into their P&L. They can't hire a lot of field reps anymore.
Sure.
Even if it's mid-market reps, it's really hard because the market thinks of you as a S&M profile, which is, let's say, 20% of your revenue or something. So how do you grow to 30 and 35? It's really hard. So again, you're walking a tightrope here. You're like, well, it's really good to have the grassroots, but I want to really go and get $1 million deals in the mid-market. You'll have to figure out timing, like when is the right time to even go after the mid-market. And with PLG now, I think it's getting a little bit easier. I look at MongoDB and Snowflake salespeople. They don't go after cold seats. They don't have to have this slide deck open up and say, here is how you spell Snowflake and here is who we are. There's enough people who are already using Snowflake inside a mid-market company or a larger enterprise. And getting that warm sort of start is great compared to the cold start. And I think PLG, for those of you who are going after the mid-market and large enterprise, is still extremely useful because you have a warm start. And
what would you see in a company which would make you say that PLG is working for this company? Is there a metric you would use? What are the top two metrics you would say that PLG is working for this company?
The proxy for all of it is sales and marketing as a percentage of revenue. Right? Nothing.
But in a startup, that metric is kind of hard, right? Because it's kind of,
Well, and you folks have come up with some good metrics already. It's called the pirate metrics. It's adoption, acquisition, advocacy, renewal, revenue, retention, R metrics, the way pirates say R, it's like, what does that mean? So I think at the end of the day, it starts with simple things like daily active usage and weekly active usage and monthly active usage. And probably that's the biggest challenge and opportunity for even us as DevRev is like, how do you really have them come back? I mean, the idea of DevRev really came out with the experience at Nutanix. We were like, oh, developers actually like talking to customers. And customers appreciate developers being in these calls.
It's more authenticity, right?
Yeah. And you have less conflict between the PM and the developer because like, hey, let me take you to the customer so that if you don't believe me, you'll believe them, So there was a really good sort of aha moment on both sides. And Slack was a great medium for this kind of discussion. Obviously, WebEx and Zoom came quite easily as well. But people hated Jira. They're like, developers are like, oh man, you want to go? And managers wanted them to go to Jira. They're like, you got to go and update the thing because my reports are failing and I don't know when the release will come out and stuff like that. So we saw an opportunity of really figuring out what it meant to take the system of record feeling, which managers really like to hang out around because, their job is to figure out reports and dashboards and burn down, sort of trending and all this stuff, capital allocation. All these are important things for them to figure out. But then also a place where developers want to hang out independent of whether the manager is forcing them to hang out or not, which is where Slack was, But Slack was expensive and you couldn't use Slack in a scalable way, in a structured way with the customers, So what does it mean to have this discussion between customers, individual developers within, and then also let managers go and run their dashboards and things like that was critical.
I think what I'm hearing is both from Nutanix and now DevRev and some of the things that you talked about is more adoption first kind of thing, right? And as VCs, I think we say that all the time. I think what we see is far more failure in distributing your product and earning true customer love versus building a good product. So I think questions like how does customer discover you? How do they engage with you? How do they purchase? And these are much, much bigger failure points, than did the code work in the end. Code not working is also fixable more cheaply. Usually it's a function of money or some time, right? Maybe a few more weeks, some more engineers, it gets done. But the other ones, they just don't get solved, sometimes even with money.
And by the way, it's harder. I'll tell you what, it's harder in PLG than it was in the sales-led motion. I'll tell you why. Like, we had customers we had done $10 million deals with at Nutanix that haven't even opened the software up in the first 7 months. Because that's how IT makes decisions. They're like, look, we like this thing. We're going to lose the budget if we don't flush our budget this year, 10 million. Right? Now it takes...
It's a very relationship-based sale. And you're there.
And by the way, whether the end user is using it or not is another thing. 5 years later, we'll talk about that, if at all, or something. But in PLG, you have to really have a direct connect to the end user. And it is like a consumer business where it has to be so natural, the adoption and engagement and the nudges. I learned the word flow theory here, talking to one of the entrepreneurs of skill sets versus, in fact, one of the other entrepreneurs came and said, you guys are not that intuitive. I'm like, okay, looks like we have to play the gaming thing here as well, this flow theory thing where it's like, here is what they know, and here is what we challenge, and here is what they know, and here is what we challenge. So we also have to do many of these things in our product to really make it, consumer grade as opposed to enterprise grade where, like, if IT buys ServiceNow, nobody cares about adoption. It's like, well, here is a ticketing system, go figure out who wants to use it, who doesn't want to use it,
Yes.
But to really do something that is PLG, basically, the emperor has no clothes or not.
No, totally. I think adoption first, customer love, I think are critical to the PLG story. And end user, like you said, not just the buyer, right? If it's meant for salespeople, then they should be loving it. If it's meant for the engineers, then they should be loving it.
Yeah. And by the way, the risk and the opportunity is product management, pricing.
Yep.
Because open source people, I mean, Dropbox, take the example of Dropbox, you don't want to bemoan your free users. So knowing what are the hooks to really move them from this tier to that tier. I think SaaS in the US has now caught up to some of that, but it is still not fully figured out. I mean, like we use Figma. I'm on Adobe's board, but we use Figma. And Shantanu gives me a hard time, like, really, you guys use Figma? But I think they figured out a pricing model that is multiplayer. So the creators, we charging them, let's say $14 or $40, but the readers don't have to be charged. And the browser surface makes it extremely acceptable and accessible to the developers. A third of Figma users are developers. So how do you really think about pricing? Is a much more upfront and upstream thing. You cannot postpone pricing 5 years, 4 years down the road, because once they're hooked to anything free, like an open source, and we heard this from the last 10, 15 years of open source, oh, how do you make money on open source? I mean, even HashiCorp struggles to make money on Terraform, and they've figured out a way to make money on Vault, but nothing on Terraform. Once you give it out and you set the expectation that it's free, you can go charge for it later, So you got to figure some things out.
It's a tricky balance because again, you're trying to get adoption, just like you said, like Dropbox users in India and Brazil, which you figure out will never convert.
That's where I think credits, we're hoping that credits will help when you set the right expectation in the market.
That it's priced but discounted right now for like two. I think that's a good,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We used to do that in sales-led as well. Like, we'd go out there and say, what's the overall price and then what's the discount. But over time, you actually have a way to inch your way up.
So you sign the paper on day one, knowing that if I will have to pay in future, I'm getting 3 months free or whatever, right? But it's not free; it's discounted for 3 months, and the price will catch up. I think that's an important lesson.
Yeah, and I think Manoj talks about this too. It's like there's some features in the multiplayer mode, like single sign-on. It's like, well, if you want automatic deprovisioning and automatic provisioning, you already have sensed the fact that it's somewhat of a more complicated user who's willing to pay now. So you want to move from a free tier to let's say a basic tier to a professional tier. I think what are the hooks that you'll need, I think is an important piece of the early puzzle for most startups.
Fantastic. We could keep
on
going.
forever.
I'm just we're I think on the top of our time, right? I think Ravi. So I think look, I mean, I greatly enjoyed the conversation, and I think.
What did the people feel like? I'm sure
love to
after
hear.
food and that kind of a dessert.
Did we put you to sleep yet, or we should keep going?
Shwetank is like, okay, time to wake up.
And we're happy to take one or two any comments or questions if folks have.
Maybe while I'm waiting to open up, how do you think of share-based compensation as a retention tool, given your long public sort of company history as well?
I think the biggest retention metric for us, or not metric, but lever for us, was respect for employees. More than equity alone. I think equity was the next step of it. But I mean, and Manoj and I used to talk about this, that Nutanix, India had very little attrition. Most people in the US like, man, you go to Bangalore, assume 30% yearly attrition. And we went through a huge public market swings because of our business model change. I mean, things that I figured out, wow, this cloud is here, we got to do subscription. And yet the employees were extremely tenacious because they felt like the kind of work they were doing was just, hard to actually get in most of the places. I mean, there's so many people who work at Uber here and places like that. They're like, well, we don't get treated the same way as the folks in the US. So I think autonomy and purpose actually become big pieces. Equity, of course, plays a big role as well. But I think the kind of work they're doing, and I feel, and we all feel at DevRev, that when they also get exposed from being relegated to the back office to saying now we can talk to customers and we can really have that empathy. I mean, look, we built a sales-led motion at Nutanix. We were spending $1 billion a year on sales and marketing at Nutanix. Looking back, I'm like, wow, this is the opposite of that. But the kind of escalations I would get from salespeople to go shout down on the product managers and the developers to go work on things, I feel like if you didn't shout down on them and you really and Slack was great for us to really make that possible, I think was a big part of our overall retention story as well. Respect more than anything else.
I guess we have time for one more if anybody has any thoughts or questions. Maybe somebody from the DevRev team, since, Shaitan, or from the audience.
Nobody brave out here. All of
There-
you are
there,
doing
we see.
entrepreneurship. You want to take horse shit out? Now's the time, actually.
You spoke about product. Yeah, you spoke about product-led growth and you spoke about sales for enterprise and mid-market. So I just wanted to know that, do you think product-led growth is the way in the next decade, or do you think sales would still work?
So I think if you were to look at the image of a funnel, in the sales-led world, the marketing department was busy trying to just get leads. No user was self-selected. They had dropped a business card in an event, like a conference, some such thing. So there's no real intent shown when they dropped a business card, because they're just coming here for a free T-shirt on the booth or something. Who knows? So marketing was very noisy in the sales-led world. And then sales is constantly looking at marketing for meeting setting. And then marketing goes and says, okay, we'll figure out meeting setters with, service companies out there. And then the sales would come back and complain about awful meetings. Why did we have this meeting set up at all, and so on? There was no qualification. So what has happened in the PLG world, what should happen, is that you let these self-selectors become signed up free users. So now there is less noise in the system. There's more signal, because they're now willing to try out your product. They're investing time with you. So now marketing can also go focus on how do you convert the free users to maybe the first tier of the paid. And then sales can go after the first tier of paid and see if they've paid you $10,000, can we up convert to 100,000? So it just creates a more efficient business model where everybody's now looking at data. In fact, that's one of the PLG things that, even we are using DevRev for DevRev's growth engine too now. But as in when we do inside sales, we'll have to have them look at data. See who to call. Do you randomly do a cold call, or do you call people who are spending time on your product? And then field reps will eventually have to go and say, do I randomly do a cold sort of meeting, or do I go after folks who actually have shown some propensity to invest in some $10,000 to make them into 100,000? And this happens now all the time. So to come back to your question, there are two sides of the same coin. Especially if you want to go after mid-market to enterprise, like Snowflake does, like Mongo does, like Stripe does, like everybody, like Adobe. I think, we have a product-led growth strategy for the last 10 years with all of Adobe's apps. But then in the larger, higher end of the market, procurement is like, hey, we need to talk because we are spending 20 million on Adobe apps and things like that. So it's a much more evolved discussion between sales and procurement that I think can only come from data. So just realize that you folks have to build a really important data funnel as well. Even for your PMs to say, look, how do we nudge these people to become paid users, and how do inside salespeople pick up the phone and talk, and eventually how do sales reps go after the warmer seats rather than cold seats? Yeah.
So in the interest of time, I guess Dheeraj, some closing comments from you. I think message for entrepreneurs. Also would love to hear kind of your observation of India, right? You have like a bird's eye view. You probably come once a year or a couple of years, I don't know, right? So,
well, I come 4 times a year now.
Oh, wow.
and doing more because I'm learning to code again with these guys. And this guy sitting in front of me makes fun of me all the time. I'm learning React, and I'm learning TypeScript, and I'm learning everything, trying to be a full stack person, because one of my sort of aha moments of building business software is that you're selling an experience. Of course, you're selling an object model and a system of record and customization and workflows and all this stuff, but eventually you're selling an experience. And I think you all want to build a engineering function, a product management function that's very experience down, design down, customer down, and make sure you don't create lots of tribes where the tribe is extremely comfortable in their little microservice, because we've overdone microservices in this world where everybody's like, oh yeah, my microservice, my repo. We have like 80 repos in the company, And I'm like, I was just trying to go do some things that required talking to 5 repos and all that. So you create these tribes, and then you leave it to PMs to figure out how to stitch it all together for the end user. I think every developer in your org has to really care about the end user. And then you actually have built a more resilient organization. So think about full stack talent as opposed to back end talent versus front end talent. And go invest in some design people. I mean, and you might not have any money right now, but you can call IIT Guwahati, you can call NID and get some interns willing to work for free. Because they're also looking for experience in the resumes. Like, I worked for this startup, that startup. So there's a win-win here between design schools and a lot of people who are sitting here who have very little money to invest in design.
Fantastic. I think I'll close out by saying that, look, we are, and I'm going to borrow a line from, I just heard from Nihar, I don't know if he's still here. So I think the line is that we continue to be excited about India, but we're even more excited about Indian talent. We see entrepreneurs doing such phenomenal stuff these days. Some things that, because I've been in the ecosystem, right, last 15, 20 years, that we couldn't even imagine can be done, from India, and, because predominantly, historically, we've been a services economy. But it's great to see. I think it's a very vibrant time, great time to build. So like it's a go build, find the people, focus on design, focus on product, and I think make sure your PLG works for you.
Awesome. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you.
Rachel. Really appreciate it.